I'd be the least likely person who you'd probably think to end up in law enforcement. It's all to do with statistics. People are numbers on a spreadsheet. Lots of corruption and lots of very poor things happening when I was in the cops.
Jay,
Hi.
thank you for coming today. How are you?
Other than the traffic getting here, I'm absolutely fine.
So let's just jump straight into it. Give us a bit of information about your childhood.
Diving right in. Childhood. Wow. Okay. Um, Probably start with my uncle being murdered, I think. Which, when you think about where I came from and to where I ended up, I'd be the least likely person who you'd probably think to end up in law enforcement. My mother's side of the family were involved in drugs and criminality, but back then, my mum was with my dad, and they were in a domestic abusive relationship. My mum still has these scars and the remnants of that today. And my uncle, so my mum's brother, he was a doorman for a Manchester club, and he was involved in all sorts, involved with like organized criminal gangs, drugs, all that sort of stuff. And then what happened was he got into a conflict with some other people, and as a result of that, he was shot, and he was shot dead. And the person who did it was caught, and the reason why they were caught was because my uncle's body was moved from the place he was killed in a car to somewhere else, obviously try and conceal what had happened. And my dad was asked to clean the car, essentially, to get rid of any evidence. However, he botched it. He didn't do a good job. So he ended up the person who shot my uncle and murdered him ended up getting caught. And as a result of that, my dad, who, like I said, was a domestic abuser. Funny story, actually. My dad assaulted my mother once when we were young. And in retaliation, my uncle and my grandfather went round with a baseball bat, and they did what they needed to do. And they told him, "Well, no, under no certain terms do you ever go near my mum again." And that's quite pertinent now I think about it, considering what my passion is now, because of course my mum did go back to this person. And then everything else happened with the shooting and the car, so that my dad ended up leaving on his own accord. He fled to Kent. So we was in Manchester, he fled down to Kent, and I never saw him again. He was then a heroin addict. And he was a heroin addict until the day he died, when I think it was about 21 when he died. So I never knew him. But the interesting thing is, as a result of that homicide, that murder, there was an appointed police officer who was the family liaison officer, and he was kept on the case for too long, really, because he'd started developing a lot of feelings for my mum. And he was 20, 25 years old, and my mum was about 20 at the time. It was me and my sister, and we were all young. I think I was about 2 or 3, and my sister was about 4 or 5. So then what occurred was they ended up starting a relationship. Of course, nowadays that would not happen. You would not be allowed to do that. But it was a bit of a different time back then in the early 90s. And he ended up becoming my stepfather. They were together for about 10 years, and he's my brother's dad. Incredible man, very incredible man. And I remember him coming home quite a few times in his police uniform, and he would come home late or he'd be on nights. The growing up as a young kid when your dad was in the police, it was nice. It was someone to look up to. But then as that relationship began to dissolve, it was actually quite awful then what happened. My mother had, I think, a lot of unprocessed trauma and a lot of issues when she was younger, which she then wasn't able to fix as she was getting older. And this resulted in compulsive spending, getting my stepdad into a lot of debt. I'm talking tens to hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of debt near the end of their relationship. My mum was clearly unhappy in that relationship, so therefore she was trying to fill a hole. And the way she filled a hole was with new objects, shiny things. I think there was one year she bought 26 cars in a single year, and they were all on finance and everything else. Yeah.
Wow.
He got funny actually. It got to the point where I'd be around my friend's house and um, my mum would drop me off in one car and then pick me up in a brand new one. And my friend's mum was like, "Is your mum bought another cat?" And at the time, I was like, "Yeah, yeah, yeah, it's fine." But now I think back on recollection, that was obviously some kind of financial abuse in relation to how she was to my stepdad. So that relationship dissolved, and I remember coming home from one day from school. I must have been about 10 years old, and there were two police officers stood in my back garden because my stepdad was on a train track wanting to jump in front of a train. The next train that comes was going to kill himself because he was in that much abject despair because he was devoted to my mother. He loved my mum, and the relationship was breaking down. It wasn't going well, and I'm sure there was affairs. There was all sorts of other things at play which weren't very nice. And being a child witnessing all of that, and it's never really even been approached by my family either. It's kind of like we don't talk about that time in our lives. And then my mum met her now husband, who again has had his own issues. Everything had to be his way. Now, of course, I'm not saying he's a bad man, but he just had his way of working and his way of behaving. And I remember police coming to the door because my mum and her new husband had an argument, and then they would go around to my stepdad's house because he thought that there was a domestic incident going on. There was all that time in my life when I was about 12, 13 years old was absolutely chaotic. And I decided I wanted to live with my stepdad. Um, I'll call my mum's ex-husband the police officer. I'll call him Dave, and I'll call my mum's new husband Robert, just for the sake of saying different names. I was living with Dave, and because he was working so much, I was on my own quite a lot. I was very, very isolated, whereas my siblings and everyone else were living with my mum. So I spent a lot of time on my own, and I think that caused me some issues growing up because I've always had quite chaotic relationships growing up. What ended up happening was I remember one day, and I remember I used to be a bit of a goth, bit of a mosher, a bit of a rocker. And I was out drinking with friends. I was probably about 13, 14. And then what happened was I ended up, kids were like, a teenager stuff, exploring sexuality, I ended up kissing another boy. And then my parents ended up finding out. And then as a result of their distaste and their upset for me potentially being gay or potentially being bisexual, they had an extreme reaction to this. I used to have very long black hair, really long black hair. And what they did was they sat me down and they blamed essentially everything on my image because they didn't like that I listened to rock music and metal and everything else. And what they ended up doing was they got to a pair of clippers and they shaved my head down to the basically a number zero. So they shaved my entire head in a way to maybe teach me a lesson or to say that it's your image which is the problem. If we get rid of your image, then you're going to be okay. Now, of course, that was just a phase, and everything else. I'm happily in a heterosexual relationship now, and all the rest of it. And it's only the past couple of years I've really started talking about this. And I've actually approached my mum and Robert since because it was kind of weighing on me that this had happened, and they can flat out denied it, absolutely categorically denied it. And as a result of that, I now know what gaslighting is. I'd never even heard the term before. It was only after I was in the police when I was older, and then I went through therapy as a result of the relationship was in that I understood what gaslighting is, and then I kind of started connecting the dots there. As for childhood, not the best. I've heard worse childhoods, but it certainly could have been better. There was a lot of exploitation in there, a lot of isolation, a lot of betrayal, and very little accountability for the fact afterwards.
So when you say exploitation, what 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 happened?
When I was maybe 14, I
Mhm.
was working for Robert. So what would happen was he was a delivery driver. I was working for him. So I would go to school. I would get up at 3 in the morning and I would go to work with him. And then I would get dropped off at school, maybe about 15, get dropped off at school, spend the entire day at school, absolutely exhausted. And then I would be expected to then go and work with him. And I would get paid £10 a time, like £10 a day. But I didn't have the choice not to go because he needed the help. So a lot of exploitation in the sense of being forced to work, being told that you have to work and do things, or otherwise, you're a piece of shit, you're not okay, you're letting the family down, a lot of like emotional blackmail too. And that continued then. So that continued from when I was maybe from about the age of 15 through to being about age 19, 20, maybe a little bit older, maybe 21. I remember I worked for him specifically for about 5 or 6 years as a delivery driver. And that happened during time of education. So if I had exams, I would be exhausted because I would have to work. I remember it got to the point where I was so exhausted. I used to I had sleep disturbances. I still have sleep disturbances now. I think because of just the amount of stress I used to be under. I mean, it taught me a good work ethic. I'm not lazy. I managed to get a lot of things done because I've never had the opportunity to not do that. But it would be like all of my bills, all of my finances would be in Robert's name. And if I didn't work, then they wouldn't get paid, and I would be threatened with, okay, well, we're going to cancel your insurance on your motorbike, or we're going to stop you from doing X, Y, and Z. We're going to cancel your phone. You have to work. You don't have essentially you don't have a choice. And I managed to break free from that when I was probably about 22, 21, 22, because of the level of control which they had over me. And it wasn't just me; it was other family members as well. But it was quite pertinent when it came to myself. And that happened for quite a long time. I was working, so I would do a 12-hour night shift, go home, have 3 hours sleep, then do another 4 hour day shift, 5 hour day shift, and then go home, have an hour, 2 hours, and then I would be back in doing another 12-hour night shift. And that was 6 days a week. And I would get paid about £200 for it. And with this encompassed my bills. I lived with my sister at the time. I got horrendously ill. I lost so much weight. I wasn't eating properly. I was constantly exhausted. I started hallucinating. I would say, was on the borderline of psychosis at some points because I'd be driving, I'd be so exhausted, and I would see people crossing the road that weren't there. I would see, um, a lamppost moving across the road, like utter just sleep deprivation. And I remember calling my parents once saying like I'm too tired, I can't go to work. And I was threatened with all sorts. But when it comes to the exploitation side as well, the money I was earning, they would then say, can you borrow us £200? Can you borrow us £500? Oh, you've scratched the van, that's another £300 you have to pay. So even though I was working so much, or essentially being forced to work so much, I'd never had anything to show for it. So in a way, it was kind of like, I don't know, like modern slavery, so to
Yeah, I was just
speak.
gonna say, isn't that like technically modern
Yeah, of
slavery?
course, I'm not suggesting that was. I just
Mhm.
think Robert was quite a controlling man when I was younger, and I wasn't able to break out of it. But thankfully, I did. Thankfully, I did. Of course, in my mind, it's just become normal now. Being isolated, seeing family break up, being exploited to the point where you're dangerously underweight, um, mental health issues. Like I'd contemplated suicide probably 3 or 4 times when I was younger. Mental health was in the absolute toilet, just a result of I had no control over anything I did. But the one thing I could control was whether I self-harmed or not. So I went through a period of quite a lot of self-harm, but I didn't actually realize it was self-harm, because what I accompanied with self-harm was cutting, poisoning, burning, stuff like that. However, what I would do is I would say if I made a cup of tea or something, I'd grab hold of the tea bag when it was really hot, or I'd put the hot spoon on me, or I would hit myself, or I'd headbutt myself, or I'd bite myself, all in a way. It's one for the frustration what I was feeling in the situation I was in. I was absolutely captured. I couldn't get out of it. But more so, well, I could control how I feel, and I can nullify myself with what I'm able to do. And my parents now, I keep them very much at arm's length because the exploitation continued when I was getting older as well. So it'd be a case of, we don't have any money, can you send us £500? And I'd be like, no, I can't because I have my own family. Okay, well, here is a letter from the mortgage advisors, the bank, essentially saying that we're going to get our house repossessed, and if you don't give us the money, we're going to be out on our street. We're going to be out on the street. Therefore, you're the reason why we're now going to become homeless. And that happened quite a few times. And it's not just happened with me; it's happened with other siblings too. So the exploitation continued quite a lot, and it's only as I've gotten older been able to say no that frankly, it's now your problem. You can't pick your family, unfortunately.
What made you decide to go into the police?
It was funny actually because most people join the police because they see they see the good work the police do, or they see this or they see that. One of my main reasons for joining the police was when I was a delivery driver. I was horrendous behind the wheel. I was always on my phone, or I would be speeding, or I'd go through a red light. And the amount of times I got pulled over by a police officer, and I never got points. I don't know how. I was just always good at able to speak to them and kind of, I don't know, talk my way out of it. And we'd just get talking, and then they'd be there like, so, what's your job like? And they'd talk to me and they'd say things. And the cops were always, even though I might have had a bit of a telling off, once that kind of been resolved, we would just talk. And I remember thinking like, that looks like a really cool job. I think I would like to try that. And plus as well, because Dave was an ex-police officer, so I would see him coming in his uniform and everything else. So I already had that. I always had that idea of what the police was, and plus Dave was a really really good guy, really cracking bloke. So in my mind, I thought, well, police are great because he's a cop, and every cop I've spoke to have always been sound, have always been nice, and it was it was just something I thought, you know what, I'll apply for the volunteer police. I'll apply, and I just sent an application in because there's different kinds of police officers. There's ones which do it full time, and there's ones that do it for volunteers. So they have an ordinary job. They're called special constables, and they just have to fulfil 16 hours a month. So I thought, you know what, I'll do that. So I applied, and I managed to get in. So I managed to do. I was doing 16 to 30 hours a month. Absolutely loved it. And then because you just get to see the good stuff when you're doing the special constable stuff, you
Mhm.
get to choose when you go in, get to choose what jobs you go to an extent. And you can just decide, okay, I'm going to go on Friday night or Saturday night. So you get to do, like the exciting stuff, the blue lights and, arresting people and all that stuff. You kind of surface level. So I did that for a couple of years, about 2.5 years. And then I thought, I'm gonna try my hand. I'm gonna apply to go full time. And it took me 2 attempts to get in. The first time, actually, I applied, I managed to get through all the stages until the vetting. And then this police officer rang me up who was in charge of the vetting, and he said, "You've lied on your application." I went, "What do you mean? No, I've not." And he said, "Yes, you have, because you have this bank default, you have this on your credit report, you have this black mark, etc." And it turns out my mother had been taking out loans and putting my name on credit reports and credit agreements, etc., and just never telling me. So I was in thousands of pounds worth of debt without actually realizing, and my credit report was in the toilet. So and some of these were back when I was 15, when I was 16, 17, 18, so quite a few years back. I actually confronted my mum about this once, and she cried and she said, "Yeah, I'm really sorry," and she promised to pay me the money back. It never happened. But I spoke to the police officer on the phone, and I was like, I don't understand. And he said, well, either you admit what you've done, or you're going to have to file a police report for fraud if you're saying it's not you. So I said, right, I'll get back to you. But just, yeah, cancel my application then, because I was in that time in my life, I was like, shit, there's more needs to go on here. So I confronted my mum about it, and that's when like I said, the tears came and everything else. I spent about a year or so kind of getting my credit report done, getting everything done, like waiting for some things to drop off, paying off some debts. I didn't have a lot of money anyway. I was working as a carer at the time. Very hard job, very rewarding job. Carers need to be paid more. You might get a cheer when people hear that actually. Listen to
I'll clip that.
it. um, so yeah, so I applied for the police again, and I managed to get in, and I served just under 7 years. So I did about 9.5 years in total. But I like saying I did just under 10 because that sounds better than saying you did 9.5.
What was your specialty in the police? Because I know you have people deal with different type of cases. What was your thing?
So I did response policing for about 5 years. And response policing is it's your everyday cop where you ring 999 and they'll go out and they'll deal with the incident. They're the ones who will come to your address and help you. So I did that for quite a while and I actually really enjoyed it because at the time you could make your own decisions, and that has very much since changed. And not just from my own anecdotal experience, also from experience from also from speaking to other police officers who have since contacted me since I've been talking about the police more. And while I was on response, I got into a coercive controlling relationship myself near the end. I was probably about 3.5 years in, 4.5 years in, and I got into a coercive controlling relationship. And what was funny was I was going to incidents of coercive control and talking to men who'd been attacked by the partner or women that had been attacked by the partner. And in my head, I'm going, that happened to me yesterday. That happened to me the other week. So while I was dealing with something, I was actually in it. So after all that happened and I got out of that relationship, given everything else where I look at my upbringing and everything else and my own experience with being a victim of that, I then went onto an investigations unit where we dealt specifically with certain cases. And the idea was that because we worked frontline, we would have more time to give a real good service to the public, but that never happened because the system worked until they broke it basically, and it just become unmanageable. But what I was able to do was I put myself forward for specialist training. So I was I did my own research when it came to stalking, and I had an interview with one of the leading stalking experts. I did advanced training in domestic violence, so I was classed as something called a domestic violence champion. I was ABE trained, so video interview trained. So when you see on TV shows, 24 hours in police custody, etc., and they're speaking to somebody and there's police officer there's somebody on a couch and they're extracting information, speaking to them.
Mm.
I did that course, so I was able to do that, which helped me get some really good results because of the level of detail you could go into and how to extract information from people. So I did those. I was drug trained, so I could field test drugs. I was kiosk trained, which means I could download people's phones and go through them. The shit people keep on their phones, things people keep on the phones is absolutely horrendous. There was actually one incident what I dealt with where it was quite upsetting really, and it was a man had he'd ended his life, and I had to go into his phone to essentially find out if there was any motivation or anything like why. And he left a note on his note section detailing his mental health, which was obviously a suicide note. But the thing what still gets me, and the thing I still think about now, is the voice notes from his kids. He had notes from his family, he had notes from friends, he had notes from his partner, but the thing what was really distressing was the voice notes from the kids. His kids must have been 5 and 7, around that age, and they were asking dad to come home. They're asking dad that they love him, and unfortunately, yeah, he was in such a distraught place that he ended up hurting himself, and that hit home quite a lot. One, because I've had those kind of thoughts myself, and that in the past of wanting to harm myself, but I've also got a young child myself, so I don't blame the man for what he did. I just couldn't see myself getting to a point where I would do that. But then again, if somebody's not well, they're not thinking clearly anyway. But the biggest thing what I was able to do was, because of my knowledge of coercive control and my knowledge of domestic violence, was you'd get a lot of officers who'd be like, "Oh God, why is she ringing us again? We went there last time and they didn't. She wouldn't give a statement last time, and he's going to end up killing her. And what can you do?" And it's like you don't understand the dynamics of a control and coercive relationship. They might want to give a statement, but they have to make that choice between, do I stay in this relationship where I could possibly be killed, or do I leave this relationship and I don't know what's going to happen? Plus, what they're also asking the person to do is to put their faith in other people, especially an agency such as the police, an organization such as the police, where they might not be the best trained, and it can be potluck of what officer you get. So thankfully, some of the people who came to me, I know that the only reason why I managed to get the results I did was because of the dedication and the training which I had. The upsetting thing as well is that the courts don't take domestic violence seriously. They don't take it seriously enough, because I've dealt with cases where a woman has been pinned to the ground and been strangled in front of her children, and they walk away from prison after a year of investigation, walk away from prison with a suspended sentence. I've had my last big case was, it was coercive controlling behavior, it was multiple assaults, it was strangulation, it was, you name it, it happened. And again, walked away from prison. There was stalking involved and everything else. This woman was living in abject fear, absolute terror every single day. And I managed to get him remanded, as in when he got arrested, I managed to put the case forward so strongly to the Crown Prosecution Service that he was able to be remanded. There was not a cat and owl's chance he would have been remanded if somebody else was speaking to that. But because I knew about the homicide timeline, and I knew about the power and control model, and I knew about essentially the things what you would need to know about in a case like that, he managed to get remanded. He was released the next day, but at least he was on tag. So that gave the victim a lot of confidence in that, one, we're taking it seriously, and two, we know where this guy is. And even after all of that, he walked away from prison with a suspended sentence. And there's plenty of other examples when it comes to that. And it's disheartening for the victim. Sometimes they're happy that they've just been listened to and that this person has been held to account. But there's also the slap in the face of the victim and the slap in the face of the officers as well, when we see the things what people go to prison for these days, and then when it comes to something quite serious, such as, essentially a homicide about to happen,
Mm.
the only thing what's missing is they haven't killed them yet or tried to kill them, but it's certainly going along that way. They walk free. They walk free from prison. So I can see why people don't put the trust in the system, because even when the officers do their absolute best and get somebody to a courtroom, the person says, "I'm really sorry, I won't do it again." And the judge goes, "Yeah, all right, see you later." And they walk free.
Most judges are men usually. Do you think that it has a lot to do with that, or what do you think? What is the reason?
I think it's a case of, I've never thought about that, so that is interesting. But I think it's a case of the prisons are just too full. Without getting too political, when we are putting people in prison for a Facebook post or a Twitter post, and they're staying in prison for a long time, and yet as a result to fit those people in prison, we are releasing people who have committed serious offences such as burglaries, serious assaults, coercive control, domestic assaults, sexual offences. We are saying that somebody posting something online is more severe than somebody who's caused actual physical harm to another person. And until that changes, there's going to be less people. There's less room in prisons. So when somebody is in front of the judge, and they say, "I'm really sorry for nearly killing my partner, or for stalking them, or ruining their life," they go, "Okay, I could send you to prison, but there's not a lot of room, so we're not gonna bother for whatever reason." I'm sure it's much more complicated than that, but that's the impression I get. They don't believe it's serious enough to warrant prison. And even if they do, there's not the space for them in prison because of the other offences what people commit, which result in going to prison.
What would you say was one of your worst cases while in the police?
The worst case I ever dealt with was the murder of Brianna Ghey, because I went to that, and that was one of the first. I was one of the first ones on scene, and it was horrific. You can see the headlines. You can listen to the testimonies of family and people that were there. I watched the documentary actually afterwards, what came out. I think it was called Brianna's Story, and I was crying watching the footage of the park and the officer that ran to the scene and got there first. It was absolutely horrendous, and I was actually kept on that scene for about 6 to 8 hours on scene guard afterwards because we had to preserve the scene, stop people going in and out while the CSI and detectives and everyone else did their work. And every cop that went there that day, we all had we had what was called a TISM afterwards, which is a basically like a traumatic incident debrief. It happened quite a few weeks afterwards. It wasn't immediate, whether that's resources, whether that's you want it to settle in first, and then you can talk about it. But we had one of those, and I was in a room with about 12 different cops, ranging from constable like I was up to sergeant. And the sergeant who was sat there in the TISM, he was a very robust sergeant, and even he started breaking. You could hear it in his voice. You could see he was tearing up, just recounting what we saw and what happened. And I've been to murders before. I've seen brains on the floor. I've seen all sorts of stuff. Um, and that was by far the worst one I've ever been to. And everybody who attended that incident have all said the same thing. It was utterly barbaric what happened, and I hope those two individuals responsible never see the light of day again.
Why is it that the police, they wait until the very last minute when this, it's usually a woman, is practically gonna die, or like that person has now took the step to now kill this person, and now they think, oh, we should do something, but by the time they do, that person is dead. Like, they've called the police loads of time,
Yeah.
they've said he's literally outside my house,
Mhm.
and they'll ask them things like, well, has he touched you? Or, well, he's just standing outside, we can't do anything about that. It's like they say to them, that person has to physically, basically, practically murder you until we can step in.
That's wrong. It shouldn't happen. I think that's getting better because of the education which is happening around stalking now. Stalking, the definition of stalking is actually very ambiguous. It's behavior which amounts to stalking, which is intentionally ambiguous because stalking can be encompassed by a myriad of different ways, different behaviors. And also, there's a lot of cyber stalking. Basically, every stalking case now has an element of cyber stalking too. Investigating stalking cases can be very time intensive, especially if you download phones. You have to look at location data, you have to do CCTV, and you have to track ANPR, so whether they've driven somewhere, and correspond that to their phone, witness statements, etc. I can't remember who it was. I think it was Laura Richards who created Paladin, the stalking advocacy service. And she described stalking as murder in slow motion. And it's the same with coercive control because it is murder in slow motion. I think when I did research into it, out of all the domestic homicides, 95% had an element of stalking. And I think about 60% had an element of coercive control. So these are the serious red flags. And the thing that is getting more, obviously, I'm not saying that the service is perfect, but when it comes to stalking cases now, I think it's taken much more seriously by the police. However, what is upsetting is that there are actually three different kinds of stalking. There is stalking involving serious alarm or distress, and there's stalking involving fear of violence. Just stalking can maximum sentence is 6 months in prison. So that is somebody who's been following you, somebody who's been texting you, somebody who won't leave you alone. So long as they've not made you feel like they're about to murder you, or they've seriously impacted your life in any way, even if they have, it's about proving it. And what the CPS will do is they'll go, okay, we could charge them with the more serious offence, but we've got more evidence of the lighter offence. So then what? So then, if I mean, stalking's horrific. Stalking's terrible. I've spoken to plenty of stalking victims. I wouldn't wish it on anybody. It's awful. They call it mental rape in the sense of this person's occupying your mind at all times. You don't know where they are. You don't know if they're around the corner. You don't know if they're going to call you, text you. It's the mental invasion of your everyday life. And somebody can get a maximum of 6 months in prison, and rarely do stalkers go to prison. Certainly if it's their first time offence. When it comes to the more serious stalking, so I've had multiple charges before of stalking involving serious alarm or distress and stalking involving fear of violence. None of them have ever gone to prison. It's been absolutely nailed on. This is what you've done. This is all the evidence as to why you have stalked this person, how you've done it. and the unbelievable impact what you've had on this person's life, to the point where they stopped working. They're essentially a prisoner in their own house because they're too scared to go outside for fear of you being there, and they walk free from prison. So even though stalking is taken more seriously now by the police, it's still not reflected in the sentencing when it comes to court.
What was the case that made you think, I can't do this anymore?
It wasn't particularly one specific case. It was more to do with the the politics and the ethos of the police. I left the police because I joined the police to help people. When it got to the point that I couldn't do that and I was getting ill as a result of not being able to do that, then that is when I decided, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I've helped as many people as I can, but it's now getting to the point where I can't do that. And the reason why that happened was officers, when I was on the front line, were able to go to an incident and look at what is the best outcome here. Is it an arrest? Is it a safeguarding referral? Is it, what evidence do we have? What's this person saying? What's that person saying? Let's actually investigate what's happened here. Let's speak to third parties. Let's speak to other people rather than just making a snap judgment. And it worked. And if somebody needed to be arrested, they would be arrested. I had one of the highest arrest rates on my entire block. And I didn't actively go out looking for the wanted people or the remands to custody. I just went, and if someone needs to be arrested, I would do it. But what happened was, near the end of my service on response, this new shift came in where you had to take positive action, in particular when it comes to domestic incidents. Now, positive action sounds really, really good, and positive action should be taken. However, what was happening was that was then being abused. So it wasn't just a case of positive action in the sense of let's do a referral or let's look at a community order. It pretty much always resulted in an arrest. So officers would go to somebody's house, and man and woman or whoever would just have had an argument. No assaults have taken place. Everyday argument. Things have bubbled up too much. Stress and it's just exploded. Somebody has called the police. Didn't even often have to be either party. And what the police were doing was going there, and somebody was coming away in handcuffs. They were asking leading questions of, have you felt scared at any point? Did you feel intimidated? Because as soon as somebody then says yes to that question, an offence has been committed, which is an assault without battery, an assault without physical contact through fear. You've caused somebody fear. Now, I think it's normal that if two people are having an argument, it gets a bit heated, that one might feel a bit taken back. Certainly, maybe if this is the first time this explosion's ever happened. But as a result of that, the police were going in and arresting people with very little evidence, very little justification at all. Then that person was then being taken to custody where they'd be interviewed. And I was on the team that would do the interview and investigation. So I'd spend my entire day, most of the time, ignoring the cases which really need my attention for people who really needed help. And I would be spending my time dealing with an incident, fighting to get it closed because there'd be no further action, knowing I'm wasting my time. And then two things would either happen then. Either an inspector would say, yes, okay, I agree with you, no further action taken, this person can go home, but we get a tick in the box because an arrest has been made, because that was what they measured it on. They measured it on arrests rather than actual outcomes. If the ethos changed to, okay, what evidence do we have of an offence, and can we prove it, and can we get an outcome, this whole thing would change very rapidly. Or what would happen was quite a more common. It would be somebody would be arrested, they'd be taken to custody, they would then be bailed, which means that they probably couldn't go home for the next 3 4 months, sometimes even more, due to the officers that would need to deal with the bail being so overworked that they couldn't even action the incident at all. Or they would have to progress a case to the Crown Prosecution Service because the people in charge of making the decision to close the case wouldn't want to, because when they went for their next promotion, they wanted to present as little, no further actions as possible. So they were actively blocking the right thing happening. And then the officers would then spend weeks preparing a prosecution for a case which they knew was going to go nowhere, to send to the Crown Prosecution Service. And I remember speaking to somebody actually who would deal with the other side of that. Somebody who worked in the criminal justice system in some capacity. And they told me that they know of 5 or 6 people that have taken their own lives as a result of being on bail for too long. And that is a result of other things, of a myriad of different things. So if you're on bail, you potentially can't go home. Well, you can't go home, you can't speak to your partner. What if your partner relies on you for money? What if they've got a newborn baby and you're the sole breadwinner? The police aren't helping you because you're the suspect and you're on bail. You potentially going to get fired from work, so therefore you've got no money. All this off the back of an argument. And it's put forward to do positive action and to help the public and to reduce domestic homicide. Because if we arrest somebody, then they know we're taking it seriously, and they understand that. But if you're arresting people and there's no evidence or there's no support and there's no history, then why was another outcome not considered? The family is clearly in crisis, and arrest might not necessarily be the best thing. Why can't we allow the officers who are doing why can't we allow the officers at the scene to make their own decisions and to do the best outcome? So that's where the corruption side comes in the sense of it's all to do with statistics. And the people that, in my opinion, the higher up you get up the chain, the more you are concerned about your own career prospects rather than actually serving the public. And as a result of what was happening, more officers were going off sick than ever before, which then puts more stress on the existing officers. More officers were suffering mental health issues. More officers were essentially being indoctrinated into this punitive way of behaving, in which, if any allegation is made, they must be arrested. And I've even heard stories where officers would go to an incident and no allegation would be made, but their inspector would be on the radio to them going, "Well, arrest them because we need to get our statistics up." So they were being told to arrest people simply for statistics, and then because of the pressure the custody sergeants were under from their higher ups, they would have to then accept them. And even when there was even a case there was even a case I was involved with where a woman dropped off her children to their father's house. The father was mentally ill and had been violent in the past. He threatened her, got right in her face, and she slapped him to get him to move away. Self-defense, common law, there is legality there for her to do that. She's then called the police and gone, "My ex-partner's just trying to attack me, I need help." The cops have turned up, two fairly new in service officers have turned up who have been indoctrinated under this ethos of, arrest first, ask no questions later. And what happened was the woman was then arrested because the male disclosed that she'd slapped him. She then stood there and said, "The reason why I slapped him was because in the past he's broke my ribs, he's bust my nose, he's trolled me, he's strangled me, he's disclosed loads of things." But the police officer is then heard on camera going, "Yes, well, you can't go around slapping people, can you?" And the children were then left with this male. So we've got a victim of previous coercive control and serious assaults defending herself from her ex-abuser, calling the police for help, and then she's punished. So what will happen next is she'll never call the police again. Her complaint against him will never be investigated, and we just lose all morality in the police. And the officers making those decisions oftentimes know it's wrong, so we can't skirt complete responsibility from them. But when they are being pressured by senior officers to make these decisions, and it's happened several times a day, and if you do make that decision, if you do make an arrest, no questions are asked. But if you don't make an arrest, you have to justify and send a 500-word email to the superintendent in charge justifying why you didn't make that arrest. Eventually, people go, "It's easier if we just do it." But then that demoralizes the officers too. And it also means that the officers, when the unit I was on, means that we are then under so much pressure because the amount of work coming in, the amount of cases coming in, which aren't going to go anywhere, which means we actually miss significant incidents too. Because there was an incident where a female was strangled really severely, and I believe she was arrested for something because her ex-partner made an allegation against her because he knew that my police force would arrest her. So the police are also being used by abusers as an extension to continue abuse. Lots of corruption and lots of very poor things happening when I was in the cops. I've worked with some absolutely fantastic officers. A lot of those officers have either moved on or they've left or they do have the confidence to push back. But a lot of the new officers don't because they're brand new, they're inexperienced. A lot of them are fairly young, so they don't have a lot of life experience. They manage to get in the police, they have this position of power, and some of them, I would say, abuse that power willingly or unwillingly based on the ethos of what's happening. My mission with what I'm doing now is to put forward the argument that the police officers on the ground are not the problem. There are a lot of inexperienced officers that are being forced to make decisions which I don't agree with, and what a lot of other people don't agree with either. But your everyday police officer puts on that uniform to try and help somebody. And I advocate for those officers. There are bad actors in the police. If you have an organization of 20,000 people and 1 in 100 is a bit bad, you have a lot of bad actors in there, and we need to get those officers out. I want to highlight the issues at the very top. I want to highlight the issues in the structure and the organization as a whole, because that's the decision to improve what's going on lies with them. But because they climb so high up the ladder, they care about their next promotion, their pension. They're in a circle of people that just agree with each other rather than the reason why they initially started. And that is to protect the public and to be a good cop. When I first started in the police, I had no idea that it would be run like a business in the sense of it's all about statistics, KPIs, key performance indicators, stats, figures, you know, how fast can we get to this instant? How many resources do we have for this? When it should be, if the police were judged and graded and got their funding from public satisfaction, there'd be a different police force overnight. But until this way of working where people are numbers on a spreadsheet, and that goes for officers and the public, then the system's only going to get worse. And I think one day we're going to get to the point where that many police officers leave due to the decisions of the people above them and government that we're going to be in a serious state of emergency when it comes to public safety.
You've written your book. Just give us a little bit information about that, where people can find it, where they can find you.
I'm like mold. I'm everywhere. So I'm on YouTube. I have my own YouTube channel. My book called The Job's Fucked: Secret Diary of a Police Officer is on Amazon. You can just search Jay Dartmoor on Amazon, or you search Jay Dartmoor on Google. You'll find my social media. Again, everything's under Jay Dartmoor. I also write crime thrillers too, so it's not all about real life experiences. I also write crime thrillers influenced and inspired by my time in the police.
Thank you for coming down to the school today and sharing your story. That's a wrap.
That's all right.
Thank you very much.
I went in deep on the childhood stuff, didn't I?